There is something terrifying about an empath when they finally go silent. Most people misunderstand silence. They think silence means weakness. They think silence means surrender. But the silence of an empath is not surrender. It is the funeral of attachment. It is the moment the soul stops begging to be understood. And once that happens, the person you once knew disappears forever. People always talk about narcissists leaving destruction behind, but very few talk about what happens when a deeply loving empath finally reaches emotional exhaustion. Because an empath does not disappear suddenly. They disappear in layers. First, they stop explaining themselves. Then they stop reacting. Then they stop fighting for the relationship. And finally, they emotionally detach so completely that it feels like they died while still standing in front of you. The terrifying part is this. By the time you notice they are gone, they already left weeks, months, maybe even years ago inside their mind. Empaths are not weak people. In fact, they are often the strongest people in the room because they carry emotional weight nobody else wants to touch. They absorb pain. They carry tension. They forgive betrayal. They sit in rooms full of emotional chaos and still try to protect everyone from falling apart. But the problem with an empath is that they believe love can heal what accountability refuses to fix. So they stay too long. They excuse disrespect too long. They tolerate emotional inconsistency too long. They keep hoping the person who hurt them will wake up one day and finally realize the damage they caused. And because of that hope, empaths slowly become prisoners of their own compassion. Most people only know the warm side of an empath, the caring side, the patient side, the forgiving side. But there is another side people rarely see, the cold side born from repeated betrayal, the side that emerges when emotional pain becomes unbearable. Freud once said that not unexpressed emotions never die. They are buried alive and return later in uglier ways. This is exactly what happens inside empaths. Every ignored boundary, every manipulation, every emotional dismissal gets buried deeper and deeper into the subconscious mind. On the surface, the empath still smiles, still helps, still gives. But underneath, resentment begins growing like poison in the dark, and one day, something small becomes the final trigger. Not because it was the worst thing that happened, but because it was the last thing their soul could carry. People are shocked when an empath cuts someone off forever. They say things like, "I never saw it coming." But the empath saw it coming for a very long time. They warned you in subtle ways, through tired eyes, through emotional distance, through conversations you ignored, through moments where they begged for honesty while you gave them excuses instead. Empaths rarely leave without trying everything possible first. That is why their departure feels so final. Because when they finally stop caring, there is nothing left to repair. They already fought the emotional war alone for too long. The truth is that empaths do not fear pain. They are familiar with pain. What destroys them is emotional betrayal. Betrayal is different because it attacks trust itself, and trust is sacred to an empath. Once trust is broken repeatedly, the empath begins to feel emotionally unsafe. Their nervous system changes. Their warmth disappears. Energy becomes guarded. They stop opening their heart because every act of vulnerability starts feeling dangerous. This is why some empaths become emotionally numb after years of toxic relationships. Not because they lost the ability to love, but because they became terrified of loving people who weaponized their kindness. There is also something deeply psychological happening when an empath disappears forever. Many empaths grow up learning that their value comes from helping others emotionally. They become hyper-aware of people's moods, hyper-aware of tension, hyper-aware of conflict. As children, they often became emotional caretakers before they were emotionally protected themselves. So, in adulthood, they unconsciously attract wounded people because rescuing others feels familiar. Chaos feels familiar. Emotional inconsistency feels familiar. They confuse emotional suffering with emotional connection. And because of that, they stay loyal to people who continuously drain their spirit. But eventually, every empath reaches a breaking point, a moment where survival becomes more important than attachment, a moment where their subconscious mind finally realizes, if I stay here, I will lose myself completely. And once an empath reaches that realization, something changes permanently. The emotional bond snaps internally. They begin grieving the relationship while still physically present. They slowly disconnect their emotions from the people hurting them. And when they finally walk, it feels almost frightening because there are no more tears left, no more begging, no more emotional speeches, just silence. That silence destroys people because they expect the empath to return. They expect another chance. They expect forgiveness like before. But what they fail to understand is that an empath who disappears forever is not acting out of anger anymore. Anger still contains emotional attachment. Indifference is different. Indifference means the emotional connection has died. And once an empath reaches emotional indifference, it becomes almost impossible to pull them back. This is why people suddenly obsess over empaths after losing them. Human psychology works strangely. People often value emotional safety only after it disappears. While the empath was present, their love felt endless. Their patience felt guaranteed. Their forgiveness felt permanent. So people became careless. But once the empath vanishes, the emotional emptiness becomes unbearable. Suddenly, the room feels colder. Conversations feel hollow. Life feels emotionally disconnected because genuine emotional presence is rare. And most people do not realize its value until they lose it forever. There is another painful truth most empaths never talk about. Sometimes they disappear because they are exhausted from being emotionally misunderstood. Imagine constantly feeling everything deeply while living in a world that rewards emotional detachment. Imagine trying to explain emotional pain to people who only understand logic. Imagine giving your entire heart to relationships while receiving emotional inconsistency in return. Over time, many empaths begin feeling emotionally homeless, surrounded by people yet deeply alone. And loneliness affects empaths differently. Most people can distract themselves from loneliness through entertainment, attention, or social activity. But empaths crave emotional depth. They crave authenticity. Surface level relationships drain them. Fake conversations exhaust them. They can sit in a crowded room and still feel isolated because nobody truly sees them emotionally. This is why many empaths disappear from society itself, not because they hate people, but because their soul becomes tired of emotional performance. The world often romanticizes empaths without understanding the psychological burden they carry. People love receiving empathy, but very few know how to reciprocate it. Everyone runs toward the empath when they are broken. Everyone wants comfort from the empath during emotional chaos. But when the empath needs support, the room suddenly becomes empty. This creates a dangerous emotional imbalance. The empath becomes everyone's emotional refuge while secretly drowning alone. And eventually, the subconscious mind rebels against this imbalance. The empath begins feeling resentment toward the very people they once sacrificed everything for. They start realizing how one-sided many relationships truly were. They remember all the moments they stayed emotionally available, while others disappeared during difficult times. And once this awareness becomes conscious, the empath starts withdrawing emotionally, not to punish others, but to protect what remains of themselves. People often confuse the empath's disappearance with cruelty, but disappearing is sometimes the only way an empath can survive. Because when someone spends years abandoning themselves for others, they eventually reach emotional collapse. Their body becomes exhausted. Their mind becomes overwhelmed. Anxiety increases. Depression grows. Emotional numbness takes over. And if they do not leave the environment draining them, they lose their identity completely. This is why some empaths vanish without explanation. They know explaining themselves no longer changes anything. They know their words were ignored too many times already. They know the people hurting them only listened when consequences finally arrived. So instead of repeating the same emotional cycle again, they choose silence. They choose distance. They choose peace. And peace becomes addictive to an empath who survived emotional chaos. Once they finally experience life without manipulation, guilt, emotional games, or constant tension, they realize how heavy their old relationships truly were. They begin sleeping better, thinking clearer, breathing easier. Their nervous system slowly calms down. And suddenly they understand something painful. They were not difficult to love. They were simply surrounded by people incapable of giving healthy love back. That realization changes an empath forever. Because once an empath learns the difference between genuine connection and emotional exploitation, they stop tolerating fake intimacy. They stop chasing people who only value them during emotional emergencies. They stop begging for consistency from emotionally unavailable people. And this is the stage where many empaths become almost unrecognizable. Stronger, colder, more selective, more protective of their energy.